Okay. Hello and welcome back to Untold Wealth. This time, for those of you who are able to see us in video. Devin, how does it feel to be in video?
It feels daunting. I can't fidget and do all the things that I usually do and space out. And then when you ask me to get involved, I go, this has made me locked in, especially because I
Okay.
can now see you sitting next to what appears to be an unlabeled but very turbulent graph.
Yes. I think we'll just hop right into it. Roll the intro, we'll get back into it, and let's start this beautiful episode. Okay. So, Devin, tell me, what do you think this graph is showing? If you had to just take a wild stab, a random guess, what do you think it would be?
That's a good question, actually. We're seeing quite a lot of what the kids would say volatility, what they would call volatility. We're seeing some very definite peaks and very prominent troughs happening. This doesn't look like the Tesla share price, unless
Okay.
it's within the
No.
last year. Yeah, the troughs are too immediate. This seems to be something to do. I'm gonna call it a government instrument, something where they announce something and then it falls off a cliff. That's gonna be my guess.
Interesting. You're actually really close. And I won't keep you in suspense for too much longer. This is a graph kind of detailing the inflation rate over a quite a long period of time. Over
Mm.
on the left here, we have around 18 and 1985 or so. And then over here, we have 1994. So a good span of
85
about,
to 94. Okay,
yeah.
10 years. Okay.
And the specific inflation graph that this is, and that we'll be chatting about today, is for Brazil.
That's a
Now,
surprise. That's a
yeah,
surprise. I didn't expect that one.
really? Because in my opinion,
Really? Did you not expect Brazil? Whoa,
you didn't
big damn
immediately
surprise.
see the graph and think Brazil. Oh, did you do your honors? Excuse me.
Yeah, clearly I missed out on that honors class about inflation in Brazil from 1984 to 85 to 94.
Okay. To be fair, I would have also never guessed this, but I have heard, and maybe you have as well, about Brazil's rampant inflation. Some
No,
people
not
say that Brazil
really.
is like, really? Okay, well, this will
Not
be a
really. Not
fantastic.
really. I haven't actually.
I'm happy to bring something to the table that you have a little bit less exposure to than you usually do. But to me, at least, in diving into this period of inflation, around 15 or a little bit longer years, was a fantastic period where Brazil had this tug of war with inflation for over a decade. And inflation's a bit of a hot topic nowadays, I feel like. So we're going to dive deep into a more historical context of how some countries have dealt with inflation. But before we dive in, it's important to set some groundwork about what led up to these really crazy looking peaks and troughs. So, leading up to the 1960s and 70s, Brazil and many other Latin American countries were making big efforts to subsidize their local industry and move away from reliance on foreign imports and things like that.
Yeah, they were
So
printing money.
they were printing money.
Okay.
That's the key
Gotcha.
takeaway of it, to be honest. Um, and some listeners might be kind of already aware of these protectionist policies, um, because places like America now have started to pump out tariffs. And Brazil at the time was tariffing imports, subsidizing their own production on credit, most importantly. And to some degree, they were quite successful. Brazil, a few other countries like Argentina and Mexico actually had successful booms in these periods. But while Brazil's industrial sector grew, there was already a financial structural imbalance that slowly showed cracks in the system. And so, by 1964, they had severe spending issues that essentially brought inflation up to 100%. And to put that into perspective, the post-COVID inflation rates in the United States peaked at around, like, I think 9.1% in June of 2022. So super bad inflation, which led to, wages being depreciated. There were strikes all over the place, and there was actually an entire military coup that ousted the president from the government.
Okay, forget about the military coup. What the hell is a wedge? A wedge being depreciated. What is that?
A wage, sorry. That's
wage depreciation.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm a little
The
shy on camera.
wages. The wages. Okay, cool. Because anyway, yeah. Okay, cool.
You haven't heard about the wedge depreciation?
No, I've never heard about the cheese wheel wedge depreciation. No, I haven't. Okay, but a coup. Okay, cool.
Yeah, wage to clarify. And that military power stayed in charge of Brazil for quite a few years. Slowly but surely, though, they started handing off the government to a more democratic leadership, which led up to them handing over officially in 1985 to a newly established democracy led by Vice President Jose Sarney, because the elected president actually fell ill and died shortly before taking power, which is also insane.
It's a wild ride. Okay, it was a wild ride.
Yeah.
It was wild.
But they passed over to the government this problem with pretty bad inflation. And we kind of get to the first little point of my graph here. And so this newly established democracy kind of came in and they were tasked with this fairly substantial inflationary rate. And they're like, what are we going to do? Yeah.
Well, I was just bewildered by the fact that Portugal had a coup at a similar time in their history as well as the Brazilians. Because, when we did the Portuguese episode, the Portugal drug episode, they had their coup in around 1979, if I'm not mistaken. And this seems eerily close to that one. So I'm just saying the world's a small place. I don't know if they're at all related to global circumstances and whatever. Well,
it was in fashion. Yeah. Everyone was doing it.
Maybe it was in fashion. Yes. Okay, cool. That was all I wanted to point out.
No, I mean, it is probably somewhat related, but I have no idea if and how.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, this new democratic Brazil under Jose Sarney began their rule. And one of the first things that they needed to handle was this nasty bit of inflation over there. And President Sarney came up and he was like, okay, I got it. I'm calling it the Cruzado Plan. And we're going to be actually talking about quite
Is that what Cruzado means?
I think it was actually named after the finance minister, something Cruzado. That's why they called it the Cruzado Plan. But a fair guess, to be honest with you.
Sure.
We're going to be talking about quite a few plans here. There's several plans to get to this point. So
okay, I'm seeing the plans. Okay, I see it.
If you forget which plan is which, that's totally fine. But for now, we're just talking about the Cruzado Plan.
Okay.
I do have a little cheat sheet that I can bring up that we can refer to. But anyway, the Cruzado Plan aimed to hinder the inflation rate, which at there's no scale here, but it was at around 12%. And they did this in a few ways. Firstly, they changed currencies to make things a little bit easier in transacting with people. So they just lobbed off a few thousands, a few zeros at the end of the money, and then dished out a new fresh start, essentially. They also enacted a few policies to combat a phenomenon that was actually quite novel at the time, called inertial inflation. I don't know if that concept rings a bell to you, or if you have a guess on what that might be.
Isn't it just inflation that persists because it persisted before, like anything inertial? I've never heard the phrase before, but that's how I would put it together.
No, critical thinking has come in handy there, because that's exactly it. Inertial inflation essentially happens when people begin to price in or index that prices will rise into everything, like wages, loans, even tax brackets as well, which was an interesting concept. So even if there's a decrease or stop to the strictly economic cause of the inflation, socially, people and businesses might still be working under that assumption, and the
Sure.
inflation will continue.
Yeah.
So to stop the effects of inertial inflation, they froze prices, wages, all indexation, exchange rates to what they were on the 27th of February and ensured that businesses held to that freeze as best they possibly could. And to be honest, it kind of worked. Even though there was no real fiscal action, no reduction in government spending, the inflation dropped from up here to down here, essentially. It dropped from 12% to 1%. And the people of Brazil cheered and began to spend like never before. Happily ever after? No, unfortunately not, because this was kind of more of a band aid without any fiscal measures in place. So people began spending and were met with shortages, trade imbalances, and no real dip in government spending meant that at November of the same year, the inflation began to rise again. We're going to skip over the Cruzado Plan number 2, which happened around like here, because it
Sure.
didn't really do much, unfortunately.
Oh, you
So,
mean,
and,
but that's at the trough. Don't you mean at the next peak it would happen?
no, 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 no. You
No.
would think so, but the
But it
Cruzado,
was going well. Why would they have a Cruzado 2 when they were going well? Did they think they could get it even further down from like
well, what
12 to 6 to like 2 or whatever?
will drop from 12 to 1 from here to here.
Oh,
But then
okay.
after the freeze stopped, so they froze all the prices, people were like, okay, great, inflation's not happening anymore. But then they stopped the freeze because it's kind of untenable to keep prices at the same rate for that long. And once the freeze ended, people just kind of got back to spending, and the same issues were still in place. So the inflation came back
Yes.
harder than ever. And yeah, they implemented a Cruzado 2, but it didn't really work out. So instead, inflation kept rising higher and higher. And they were like, okay, we have an election coming up in 1987. So we need to enact a new plan. And so they thought of another plan called the Breza Plan. This plan was a little bit more nuanced, and it took place like right over here as inflation was peaking up to around 20% at its peak. And they introduced essentially a like universal or a price reference unit. They froze prices once more, but this time they would essentially try and monitor and selectively open up prices instead of just blanketly unfreezing them after that like 3 month period or so. And they finally introduced some fiscal responsibility as well. So they stopped funding for some subsidies, large projects like the Sao Paulo Rio bullet train, and things of that nature. They also began trying to repair their relationships with foreign creditors because they actually owed about $1 billion to the Paris Club at the time, which was a group of like foreign nations that offered credit to countries uh, that had scared off investors, which had also contributed to the inflation. But unfortunately, even though it did work for a time, inflation came back once more when they stopped the freeze. I'm going to pause here because this is a lot of information. Any thoughts on that?
Um, I do have one thought, and it's a bit of a sidetrack, but
Go for
this
it.
is this is bringing me back to the episode we did on Rome and kind of how their currency developed.
Uh huh.
And at one point, the Roman emperors were siphoning out silver from their currency. And this was like a long, basically, there was this pattern of Roman emperor would come in, they would re put in, or they would what's the word? They would add more silver percentage into the coins, okay? But then to fund wars and to build like extravagant projects, the next emperors would decrease the amount of percentage silver in the coins. It eventually
Right.
makes people want to just value silver and not the coins. So people start valuing the silver. And back
Mm.
then, they also tried to do this whole thing of like, let's keep a chicken worth 5 copper, or like, whatever they called it back in the day, or 5 silver. But
Yes.
when when people are told what things are worth, it just doesn't work, essentially, is what I'm trying to get at. It happened back
Yeah,
then, it happened in Brazil. It just never works.
it's it's actually really interesting that you bring that up, and I'm going to put a pin in that thought, especially the idea that people start valuing something else over something else, because that's actually going to come into play in the finale of our story.
It's called
But
history, baby. It's called
yeah,
history.
it's all cyclical. Um, yeah, I'm gonna maybe slow it down a little bit as well because I don't know if I'm rushing through things here. But the Bresser plan unfortunately didn't work out. And similar to kind of the issues that you just raised, people, even though they had this freeze in that stopped inflation artificially, people kind of didn't really, respond well once the freeze like got let go. They continued their spending, the same problems continued. And although the Bresser plan had some fiscal austerity with a lot of these fundings being stopped, they were very kind of short term things. Like stopping large projects, does help a little bit. But if you don't have a long term plan in place on like how to reduce government spending, then the same kind of issues are going to come back and with a vengeance as we head over here to what was known as the Summer Plan. So President Sani, unfortunately, um, didn't have success with the Bresser Plan either. And with inflation higher than ever, at this point around 75%, he's like, okay, we just need one more plan to make this work. The 1989 elections are coming up, and we need something to fix this, or we're all out of the government. We're screwed, essentially. And the third plan that they enacted was called the Summer Plan and had a lot of similar features to the previous ones that I've mentioned. Wage freezes, they got a new currency that replaced the previous currency that they replaced called the Cruzado Novo, where they also just chopped off a few zeros at the end of it. They again tried to reduce government spending even further by firing like 90,000 federal employees. They also abolished the URP system that I briefly mentioned. But to no surprise, this didn't really get anything done. They kind of followed a similar pattern to what they'd done before, but not really learned from much. And since they like killed off 90,000 federal employee jobs, for a second there I was going to be like, they just killed
They just
90,000
killed
people.
90,000 state employees. Yeah, that'll make the people real happy.
No, they slashed 90,000 jobs, which obviously did not leave them happy with the like local Brazilian population. So to nobody's surprise, President Sani did not get re-elected, but was instead replaced by President Collor in 1989. And as you can see, we're kind of, if this is a roller coaster here, we've had a few little ups and downs, ups and downs, ups and downs. But, President Collor's election, or I guess taking over the mantle of president, happened around here, I think, more or less. And you can see there's a very big peak here that we have yet to tackle. Because inflation came back with a mighty bite. It was the highest inflation rate so far at 81%. And so something drastic was needed. And President Collor came out swinging with the biggest stick so far. He implemented the Plan Collor. They love their plans, these Brazilians. They love them.
The Collor Plan.
Do you want to guess what he did first? Just by the pattern that we have here?
Did he just cap prices again and cut a few projects again?
You're forgetting one important detail. He changed the currency. He changed the currency again.
He changed the currency again. Okay, it's hard to keep up with it. Okay, it's hard to keep up. So it's kind of three things that they do each time, pretty much.
Yes.
Okay.
He changed the currency to the Cruzeiro, and he did also freeze prices like his predecessors. But to dissuade inflation from coming back as soon as the freeze was done, he also froze 80% of all bank deposits in Brazil for a year and a half, 18 months. And that to me is insane.
He froze
Brazilians
them.
didn't
They
have
couldn't access their money for 18 months.
Brazilians didn't have access to 4/5 of their money at all for a year and a half.
I can't believe that.
How insane is that?
They are sitting, their money is in the bank. Inflation is going up. Their money is just sitting there deflating in a bank.
Yeah,
They're watching wealth disappear before their eyes. They can't access it.
I guess the premise that President Collor had here was like,
It was like decrease economic activity by making everyone poor. Is that it?
By making everyone.
Very
essentially
cool. Oh, interesting. Yes. Very interesting.
And to kind of put salt in the wound further, he also raised the cost of bank transfers at the time as well, to reduce any flagrant spending that could incite new inflation.
Okay.
You know, just in case people wanted to like really dish out their 20% income. But surprise, surprise, from 81%, the inflation rate dropped down to around 9% or so.
Right back to where we started.
But the asset freeze triggered a recession, surprisingly, I think, and caused massive public backlash. Like if you're a Brazilian and suddenly you're like, okay, I can't access 80% of my money, you're going to be pretty upset about that, I imagine. Yeah. So massive public backlash. President Collor was like, okay, cool. You know, inflation's coming back up a little bit. Let's do the Collor Plan 2 and like reintroduce some of these controls that we've done because inflation was beginning to surge once more. But that didn't get very far. And President Collor then was later impeached in 1992 because he was like, there was some corruption charges or whatever. So Brazil, after taking the wildest roller coaster of their life, was around here at this point and slowly finding that the inflation was coming back up to levels that they had seen before. And I think an aspect of this that we don't really cover here in this kind of economic framework is like the people's perspective. Like if you're a Brazilian, like these like 10 years or so of like living is crazy. There's a new currency every like year and a half, 2 years. You suddenly don't have access to like most of the money that you own. And then most days things are way more expensive than they were the previous day or the previous month. People were like, not, they were right to rebel, but they were also getting pretty fatigued, I think, by all these different plans that the government was putting forward to reduce their inflation. But thankfully, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, because replacing President Collor in 1993, President Itamar Franco and Finance Minister F.H. Cardoso introduced something new, the Plano Real, the real plan. All of these other plans, they were fake. They were just practice. This was the real plan.
Devin. You cannot make it up. Dude. Oh, the Plano
This is
Real.
the real one.
Unbelievable.
The real plan.
The real plan.
And
the real. Okay.
I'm very happy to say that this one actually worked. Just to, you know, give us a bit of relief here. After this plan happened, inflation was pretty good. It was like down here, and my whiteboard nearly fell off. Okay, cool. She's back in action.
We don't need it anymore.
We'll keep it here just in case. It's still standing. Okay. So finally, the Plano Real, the real plan, was actually effective. And how they did it was actually super sophisticated. Now, this took it took quite a long time for me to understand this conceptually. So I'm going to do my best to explain it. What President Franco did was instead of like doing any wage freezes, what he did was introduce fiscal reforms first, and then introduced a unique little accounting thing called the URV, which they were going to use to recalibrate prices. And what the URV was, like imagine you're going into a shop and you see the prices of your like bread, your milk, your cheese or whatever. What they would do is they'd have this like very stable URV price that did not change. So from month to month, the URV price for bread would be 1 URV, for example. And then next to it, they would have the Cruzado price or the Cruzeiro price, I think at the time, that would be going up and down with inflation, because at this time inflation was still rising quite heavily. And this introduced a bit of stability into the mind of the Brazilian consumers, because over time they would start thinking about prices not in the terms of like the inflation or the inflating Cruzeiro, but in the URV. So they would know like, okay, my bread is always going to be 1 URV when I go to the shops, and then I hand the like teller my Cruzeiros and he does the exchange for me and I don't have to stress about it, essentially. And slowly but surely, people began to just quote things in URV. So instead of, these massively inflating prices, your wages would be in URV. Your person that you paid rent to for your home would quote it to you in the URV, the stable virtual unit. And over time, on the 1st of July 1994, the URV simply became the new national currency, which really made me think about that example that you said about the silver and how people started just associating one thing with the currency instead of what it actually was. But before I carry on, does that make sense to you?
That's brilliant, hey? I mean, is that not like the only thing that could work? And it sounds so bizarre. All they essentially did was put a price tag that wasn't changing next to the ever-changing price tags.
Yes.
Basically is what that's all they did.
Mm-hmm.
And ever so slightly, month upon month, year upon year, people just slowly started seeing, hey, it's just way easier to think in terms of that one.
Exactly.
It's like, it was just it's behavior theory, basically. They just,
Yeah.
that's really cool. That's actually incredible.
I had the same kind of reaction. Yeah, I thought I was like really trying to wrap my head around it. And I did the same thing that you just did, where like you start laughing to yourself a little bit at the sheer like brilliance of it.
Yes.
Where you're like, oh my
god,
but
it's so stupid crazy. As well. It's so it's the stupid brilliance of it that makes me chef's kiss. That's amazing.
Yeah. It was the real plan. They weren't lying to us this time. They did also, like, on the back of this, actually start with fiscal reforms as well.
Yes.
And like cut a lot of government spending. So this wasn't just a simple little, magic trick that changed the minds of consumers and stopped inflation, but it was a unique way to stop the fatigue, I think, and then also stop this continuing inertial inflation that people had gotten used to at this point.
Yes.
Which to me is super interesting.
I just love the idea of all of these government officials, economists. They're all sitting in Brazil's greenhouse, not the White House, the greenhouse. And this one guy's like, what do we do? What do we do? And then like he stands up and he's like, we actually just do nothing. We actually just put a price next to the other prices. And then they're like,
brilliant.
It's like, it's the reverse of the meme where they don't chuck the guy out the window. They just they keep him in the building.
They give him a promotion.
That's the real plan.
It is the real plan.
It's the real
do
plan.
Nothing and it will sort itself out, essentially. Now there's some kind of like financial complexity and like economic complexity to the URV
Sure.
that I'm not even going to try and explain because I
Yes,
don't think I'll
yeah.
do it justice.
We're belittling it a little bit, but I'm sure there was, yeah.
But the kind of psychological and behavioral reset that this was is like totally legitimate, as much as we're kind of, exaggerating on it. And yeah, the Plano Real was considered to be the definitive solution that ended Brazil's entire like 15-year period of hyperinflation. Just with this beautiful little trick, as well with some fiscal discipline, some reforms, and like this like market like modernization, I suppose.
It's like a miracle. It's a miracle.
Yeah, and on the 1st of July, as I said, the URV quietly became their new currency. And I think today Brazil still uses the URV. Hopefully, I'm not corrected on that because that would be very poetic.
Mm.
Uh, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Brazil, this isn't kind of like, oh, they've had inflation and then now they've been stable up until now. Brazil has had inflationary periods since then. I think in 2014 there was one, as well as in 2020 as well. But to kind of just capture this little period of time where Brazil was having this tug of war with inflation and they had plan after plan after plan after plan and finally succeeded in curbing this rampant like time of hyperinflation is really quite beautiful to me and a little slice of history that I had not known about up until now, but is super fascinating. And
Can't believe I've never
yeah,
heard of it. It's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I feel, when you research stuff, every country's had something go down like this, like, so it's
yeah,
hard to like keep them all in your heads. But this one is very special, I think. That little, just to put the cap on it, is really cool. The Plano Real. What is the inflation right now,
I
Brazil?
think, I mean, I can look it up for you real quick, but I
Give it a little
think it
Google.
is,
It's probably around between 4 and 6%, probably much like South Africa. Can't imagine it being lower.
it's currently at the time of recording around 5%, so a little bit on the higher side.
5%. Yeah, yeah, that's a bit on the higher side, but that's probably their range, is between 4 and 6%. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's very cool.
but
Very cool.
I I I admit I've recently been very taken by Brazil as a nation, and this was a great excuse to dive into their monetary like history, I suppose. And yeah, any final thoughts before we cap off the first ever video episode of Untold Wealth?
It's just one. I think it's just tough to
Go
be a
for it.
central bank because you're
Yeah.
very much you have to. I mean, there's reasons why central banks have a chairperson, and they are very vocal, and they
Mm,
are very transparent about plans. It's because they realize they can change a percentage point or basis points every now and then. But
yes.
if they aren't communicating to a people that holistically believe in the fiat currency and what they want to do, then it just won't work. It just won't work. So it's very, very important, the role that central banks play. And apparently, not too soon from now, our South African central bank is looking to decrease our target, which is controversial because typically higher inflation rates lead to lower unemployment because there's more market activity. Um, yeah, so it's a bit controversial because most central banks have this dual mandate: keep prices, maintain price stability, and promote employment. So they have a dual mandate, but I think most of the times the central banks, and I think they are right for this, do focus on that inflation aspect. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've also grown like such a great appreciation for monetary policy and like these central banks because I can like you read about this stuff and you listen to it and it's this like wild ride. Obviously, no country is following exactly this like pattern here, but to continually fail and have to go back to the drawing board and be like, okay, do we let's just change the currency and see if it works. Um, is like super tough. This is a big prop to the Brazilian
America.
government and central banks all over the globe. Those who are, not corrupt and intending to do well by their countries, at least.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Well, unless there's anything else that you want to mention, I'll cap off the episode. For those of you who enjoy Untold Wealth, thank you for listening and potentially also watching.
You
for the
guys
first
should
time.
watch. There was a lot going on in the video. Vince is a very energetic guy, and the graph is just perfect. It's
Purely
perfect.
for the graph, I think.
The graph is what you want. Listeners, it's a
But
normal graph, but it's gold to us.
this, yeah, I mean, I'm super excited to hear the feedback. Please do leave us a 5-star review, leave us a few comments. We're always looking at them and seeing what we can do further. But until then, until next time, this has been Vince Bullock, joined always by
Dev Murphy.
and we'll see you next time.
See ya.